Okay, so this slide right here is a picture like of the Arc of Triumph in Rome, and the point of it is all roads lead to Rome. And what this slide symbolizes is this is what it's like for calcium. There are multiple things that increase cytoplasm calcium in neurons, and that's an important point. You got to know that. Increased cytoplasm calcium activates the neuron, something happens. Okay, and normal activation, like, oh, you learned something interesting, you want to remember it, that's good activation of a neuron. But activation of cytoplasm calcium being elevated because you ate a toxin in your food, that's bad. That does not lead to a useful brain activation. Okay, so here's a drawing of some of the details, and there's lots of things. Like if you don't have good mitochondrial function, you can't make enough ATP, you can't pump the calcium out of the cytoplasm, cytoplasm calcium increases. You got a problem with inhibition of the circuit pumps. You can't pump calcium in the endoplasmic reticulum, cytoplasm calcium accumulates, goes higher. Okay, excessive dietary sodium, you don't run your gradients as well as you should, increase cytoplasm calcium, and you activate sympathetic nervous system. Okay, excessive psychological stress, sleep deprivation, caffeine, increase activation. Okay, food toxins like aspartame, excessive amounts of monosodium glutamate, manufactured free glutamate, glyphosate, all these things are overactivating these neurons, increase cytoplasm calcium. That's bad. High-fat diets, so you can't, you use up all your insulin-degrading enzyme with the elevated insulin as a consequence of a high-fat diet, then you start getting accumulation of beta amyloid protein. It crosses back across the blood-brain barrier into the brain, and that'll cause increased activation of NMDA receptor, increased cytoplasm calcium. Not good. Leaky gut causes problems that lead to increased cytoplasm calcification. Lack of dietary potassium and magnesium, increased cytoplasm calcification. Excessive EMF from your cell phone, increased cytoplasm calcification. Okay. Brain inflammation, activating what's called the iNOS pathway, the inducible nitric oxide synthase pathway. That can activate something called the NO pathway, increase calcium in your brain. Volatile organic chemicals. Okay. One of my relatives today just went to get her nails painted, and I told him, you better ventilate the room well. Don't ever go to one of those nail salons. Smelling paint doesn't do you much good. A lot of these painters, they end up stupid if they're inhaling these volatile organic chemicals. They're not good for the brain. Okay. Anything that rapidly transitions from liquid to solid gives off VOCs, volatile organic chemicals. So here's a little more detail. When this neuron is activated, the glutamate neurotransmitters are released into the synaptic cleft. They diffuse across the synaptic cleft. They cause sodium to enter through the AMPA receptor. It depolarizes the postsynaptic neuron, making its charge more positive. That lets the magnesium no longer be attracted to the previously negative charge. It pops out. Now this NMDA receptor, the other type of glutamate receptor, allows calcium to come in. Calcium goes up in the cytoplasm. In normal amounts, it's a good thing, but in excessive amounts, it starts causing trouble, like activation of Calpain, and Calpain starts destroying things. So that's why you don't want excessive activation. And that's why people are in danger nowadays, that they're letting too much calcium into their postsynaptic neurons, and you're causing overactivation of these neurons, and people are gradually losing more and more neurons and ending up with brain damage, ending up stupid. Okay. People who are dietary deficient in magnesium, they don't block these NMDA receptors as well as they should. Okay. All right, here's a little more detail about what happens in the postsynaptic neuron. When you get excessive calcium entry into the postsynaptic neuron, it'll also activate something called NNOS. NNOS means neuronal nitric oxide synthase. So you've got the good nitric oxide synthase, the one we've all heard a lot about, is in the endothelium, in the arteries of the body, and that's good. It keeps them vasodilated. The neuronal nitric oxide synthase is usually a good thing, but it can be overactivated in the setting of excitotoxins and whatnot, and it can make too much nitric oxide. The excessive nitric oxide will then go to the mitochondria, and it can combine with superoxides. Superoxides are normally produced in small amounts. Sometimes they can produce in excessive amounts, but let's just say normally in small amounts, but they can combine with the nitric oxide, and that can form then peroxynitrite. So nitric oxide plus superoxide leads to the formation of peroxynitrite, and that's written ONOO. Okay, so this pathway from nitric oxide to peroxynitrite has been called the NO pathway. That's worth knowing. You're going to hear about that again. The NO pathway. Okay, Martin Pall is the guy who's most popularized the clinical significance of that pathway. Okay, and if you damage the mitochondria enough, the cell will just die. Cell, if it can't make energy, it just dies. It'll activate what's called the apoptosis pathway. And we're not going to talk too much about the apoptosis pathway, but it's good to know. Also, when you have excessive amounts of peroxynitrite, it can directly cause increased activation of the mDAR receptor, making it more excitable. It does something called nitrates the NR1 subunit. Okay, but the bottom line is you don't want this peroxynitrite being formed. All right, it causes problems, and the way you avoid it is you avoid overactivation of your calcium channels, so you don't get so much calcium into this postsynaptic neuron. You want to keep everything good. Keep everything good. Okay. And the way you keep everything good, same old story: low fat, low sodium, vegan diet. All right, I'm going to go through a little more detail here about what's happening. So again, these are things that all increase calcium in the cytoplasm. I went in more detail here about all these excitotoxins. Some psychiatric drugs are essentially excitotoxins. Okay, lack of magnesium contributes to that effect. Corticosteroid medications contribute to that effect. Excess use of your cell phone next to your head. Use your speakerphone instead. That's much better. I talk about excessive dietary sodium, mitochondrial inhibitors preventing you from making enough ATP. The bottom line is when your mitochondria is not working well, and it's partially inhibited, you start dropping more electrons off the electron transport chain, and they drop down into the matrix and they hit oxygens. And when they hit oxygens, because normally you need 4 electrons to reduce oxygen and convert it into water. When you're only dropping down 1 on there, you can form what are called superoxides, which are free radical oxygens. And then these, if they're sitting around in the mitochondria and nitric oxide comes along like I just showed you, they'll combine with each other and form peroxynitrite. And the peroxynitrite's bad. It'll damage the mitochondria. It'll damage the NMDA receptor. It just, in significant amount, it just leads to cell death. Okay. I'll explain a little more about how this all works in a moment, but I'm just getting you used to the words and the ideas of it. Okay, here's an example of what's happening in a mitochondria. Here's the outer mitochondrial membrane. Here's the inner mitochondrial membrane. When you start inhibiting these electron transport protein complexes, you're going to start dropping electrons. So here's an electron dropping off a coenzyme Q, and it's going to combine with an oxygen sitting around in the mitochondrial matrix to form a superoxide. So O2 with a little dot right there for free radical, unpaired electron in its outer orbital, can combine with nitric oxide and form peroxynitrite. The peroxynitrite then goes around damaging things. Okay. So you don't want this, okay? You want good antioxidant systems in your mitochondria to quench these superoxides as soon as they form. And you don't want excessive nitric oxide. It's a gas. It can diffuse into the mitochondria, start causing trouble. Okay, here's a little more detailed summary of some of the things happening with nitric oxide. And the big thing to know is that the nitric oxide you got on your endothelium, enos, sometimes also called number 3 type nitric oxide, that's good in your endothelium. That opens up your arteries. That's the good guy. The neuronal nitric oxide synthase, sometimes also called nitric oxide synthase number 1, that is kind of the neutral one. Under normal conditions, it's a good guy. Under bad conditions, it becomes a bad guy, and it makes too much nitric oxide, okay? You can also have things that will uncouple nitric oxide synthase, like if you have a lack of folate because you don't eat enough plants, folate, F for folate, F for foliage. Also, if you're deficient in vitamin C and B12, you'll get uncoupling of this nitric oxide synthase enzyme, neuronal NOS, and then you'll form superoxides. That's bad, okay? Peroxynitrite itself can uncouple the function of the neuronal nitric oxide synthase, okay? Diabetes also makes things worse, all right? And then there's a whole bunch of things that will lead to production of increased nitric oxide, in particular activation of your microglia. That's bad. And they've got inos. Inos is different than these guys. These guys are only on briefly, like for seconds or minutes, and they shut off or less. Whereas inos, it can stay on for hours. All right, and that produces tons and tons of nitric oxide. And that just makes it more likely that sooner or later this is going to diffuse into the mitochondria, combine with superoxides, form peroxynitrites, and then peroxynitrites, like a bull in a china shop, goes around breaking things. And look at some of the things that can do it. A lot of these things start with the letter I. Ischemia, lack of blood flow, like we talked about the Jack Delatorre carotid tied off in the mouse. overtreated hypertension. And if you don't treat the hypertension, it damages the arteries in the brain, causing atherosclerosis. So it leads to the same effect. So with hypertension, you want the Goldilocks balance, the right pressure. How do you get that? Minimize dietary fat and go easy on the dietary sodium, okay? And go easy on the, don't be drinking things sweetened with high fructose corn syrup. Okay, other things that'll do it: intoxication from alcohol, infections, inflammation, traumatic brain injury, leaky gut with LPS and LTA, bacterial endotoxins getting into the brain, activating your microglia. Let's see, some of these toxins like HG. HG is a toxin associated with high fructose corn syrup. You can also have insulin resistance will lead to the production of increased advanced glycation end products, and that can also contribute to activation of inos on your microglia. So that can be a problem as well. Antioxidants help to block this stuff. All right. So that's why you want to try to do everything as best you can, so that there's going to be some things you're not even aware of. But if you've got everything optimized, then you'll get the best possible outcome. Where I see a lot of people have trouble is they think, oh, I'm doing okay, I'm not as fat as my cousin. But they don't understand. They're already got, 10 different things working against their brain. So the goal should not to be just not as fat as your pathetic cousin, but to be as good as you can be. Okay, you keep your smarts. Okay, like I said, I'm 60 years old. My brain still works fast. I can easily write a book chapter in a day, all right? I can exercise. I can run up 10 flights of stairs pretty easily. And I just say this because the average patient I talk to, you ask them a question, a simple question, and there's like this PR interval wait time before they can even answer a simple question. I feel sorry for them, but they really don't have any hope of getting better. You got to have energy. You got to be willing to change. You got to have sort of the sophistication to say, hey, I screwed up. I ate the wrong stuff. I didn't get enough sleep or whatever other habits causing you problems. I'm going to fix it. I'm going to be better, like Scrooge. There's a new life. I can change. I can redeem myself. Okay? Lots of people save themselves if they get their act together. It's just like I said, though, the fatter and stupider and lazier an old person gets, the less likely they're ever going to turn it around. Okay, so we talked about how aspartame, the sweetener, can activate the NMDA receptor. We talked about how glyphosate, the herbicide sprayed on GMO soy, and also on corn and a few other things, and even non-organic beans that'll be sprayed on there. That can activate NMDA receptor. High-fat diets can lead to accumulation of beta-amyloid protein in the brain. That can activate the NMDA receptor. Let's see, and then we talked about the consequences of that. You get excessive calcium in here, you'll activate Calpain, that'll start damaging things. That can damage the NaCa exchanger. You get excessive activation, I don't have it drawn on this particular picture, but you get excessive activation of neuronal nitric oxide synthase. That'll make too much nitric oxide, it'll diffuse into the mitochondria, combine with superoxides, produce peroxynitrites, and that'll damage the neuron. All these things can kill that postsynaptic neuron. So that's what I meant by I showed you that brain shrunken away from the inner table of the skull, because it's atrophic. Atrophic is due to chronic apoptosis, meaning chronic gradual loss of neurons. Okay. And by the way, what I'm showing you is pretty sophisticated. I can tell you this is not in neurology textbooks. This comes from the scientific literature, okay, about the brain, neuroscience literature. The average neurologist you talk to won't know all this stuff, okay? Because they're sort of trained like any other medicine, internal medicine related subspecialty. Man, it's the ill to the pill and send the bill. I got a lot of friends that are neurologists. I like them. They're smart, but this is not in their literature. They don't know anything about nutrition. They know a little bit about excitotoxicity in the context of post-stroke recovery and in the context of epilepsy, but they really don't know much about it because you can't really understand it unless you know nutrition and toxicology, and they were not taught those things. And epidemiology helps, but nutrition and toxicology are the big two things to know to make sense out of all this stuff. Okay, like I said, excessive peroxynitrite will nitrate the NR1 subunit of NMDA receptor and make it more excitable, meaning make it more prone to allowing calcium to come through. This is just a repeat slide. You've seen this. Presynaptic, postsynaptic neuron, and then the astrocyte over here, so tripartite synapse. Okay, here is a pissed off guy, and he's got this is called the rage reaction. He's got sympathetic autonomic nervous system activated, and this will increase cortisol, increase catecholamines, adrenaline, noradrenaline, and that'll increase glutamate at the synapses. And then psychological stress, the equivalent hormonal effects come from, you can get it with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. You can get this with sleep deprivation, with caffeine ingestion, okay? And stimulants can do something similar to this. So like if you're taking amphetamines, attention deficit medicines, those are also stimulants. Cocaine, all of these things are ramping up sympathetic. Excessive dietary sodium, to a lesser extent, can ramp up sympathetic a bit, okay? And I also told you MSG, just intrinsically, besides its effect on synapses, it'll increase cortisol secretion in the blood. Okay, I did a whole book report on a book about that. So cortisol does a lot of things, but for our purposes, all we really care about is, let me just try to shrink myself here. All we care about is that it increases glutamate in the hippocampus. That's the main point. Other bad things it does for your health. It increases blood lipids, predisposing to diabetes. Increases blood glucose, predisposing to insulin resistance and diabetes. Okay? Causes retention of sodium from the kidneys, increasing blood volume, hypertension. Because again, the purpose of your stress response is being chased by a tiger in the dark so you can climb a tree real fast. But it's not good when you're just chronically stressed and you're just walking around hypertensive for no reason with hyperlipidemia and hyperglycemia. You don't want that. And it makes it hard to sleep. So cortisol is sort of like the opposite of the seesaw of melatonin. Melatonin helps you sleep. Cortisol is being stressed out and wired so you can't sleep. The other component of the other side of the seesaw would be oxytocin. Oxytocin is the love hormone. Oxytocin is like you're around your family and you're all getting along well and everybody's happy and taking it easy. Okay, that's good oxytocin, the happy hormone. Okay. Cortisol does other bad things. It makes you weak. It suppresses your immune system. You don't need an immune system when you're running from a tiger in the dark. You just need to survive the next 30 minutes. So it doesn't want to waste its resources of energy on things that don't matter at the moment. Okay, just another reminder of the synapse. Cortisol will activate glutamate release. Voltage-gated calcium channels letting calcium in activate glutamate release. Oh, I just threw this other slide in here to show you what GABA is all about. GABA is sort of the opposite of glutamate. So again, 90% of neurotransmitters are glutamate, this guy right here. GABA is about 5% of the brain neurotransmitters, and this will shut things off. So it lets chloride in, which makes the resting memory potential more negative inside the neuron, and that helps to turn it off, okay? So GABA will help to block all this. So glutamate is turning the light switch on to activate things. GABA is turning the light switch off to turn things off, to deactivate a neuron. All right, we kind of went through this one already. I'll skip that. Now I'm going to start telling you a few interesting things about neurons. And then, by the way, we haven't got to the good part of this talk. Right now, just so you know, everything I've showed you so far is building up to the understanding of what are the consequences of eating different types of foods. But I wanted you to have all this background so that when I refer to stuff, it'll make sense. You'll have a picture in your mind's eye. You can see what I'm saying. Okay, so here's just a paper, monosodium glutamate and epilepsy. So increased MSG in some people will lead to increased brain glutamate, and that'll be associated with increased risk of seizure. Okay? And to me, it's glutamate. I don't really care about MSG. What I care about is glutamate. All right, now here was an interesting thing. I did a book report on this book here. This lady researcher, she wrote a book about the monosodium glutamate effect on plasma cortisol. And again, the monosodium doesn't matter. It's the glutamate. Increased blood glutamate leads to increased blood cholesterol. That's a big deal. And when they injected MSG, they got a significant increase in plasma cortisol. Okay, cortisol increases blood glucose, blood fatty acids, blood lipids, blood triglycerides, and it causes insulin resistance. And it'll also lead to a loss of muscle mass. Okay, but that's an important point. The glutamate is causing a sympathetic response and increased cortisol. That's a big deal to know that. Because it creates the potential for a vicious cycle. A vicious cycle is something that doesn't go away on its own. You keep pumping in this glutamate through MSG, MFG, and just glutamate for whatever the source. MFG is manufactured free glutamate. You're going to increase your cortisol. That's going to increase your brain glutamate, and you're going to keep cycling around. All right. This itself is glutamate, and it's reinforcing itself into a vicious cycle with this. And you add to that stressed out, drinking caffeine, sleep deprived like a typical American. You're going to keep your cortisol high. Your insomnia is going to get worse. You're going to become anxious. You're going to become fat. You put MSG in food to make it taste better, and people eat more. They get fat. You put like dietary sodium in the food, that also tastes better. They eat more. They get fat. Okay. MSG is good for making research animals fat, good for making humans fat, and it also increases the risk of diabetes. Okay, that's the end of part 2, and we'll go to part 3. I think there's 4 parts altogether, and trust me, it's going to keep on getting better and better. But I had to do this background so that everything will make sense when I explain the effect of different foods.